Imagine living in a world where the truth you hear depends entirely on which empire's messenger arrives first, where information travels only as fast as a galloping horse, and the version of reality you receive is carefully curated by rulers thousands of miles away. This wasn't just a possibility, it was the reality for millions of people across ancient and medieval history. From the sun-baked plains of Persia to the wind-swept steppes of Mongolia, the earliest postal systems were far more than simple networks for moving letters. They were powerful, intricate instruments of control, designed to shape beliefs, enforce loyalty, and cement imperial authority across staggering distances. These systems didn't just carry messages, they carried carefully constructed narratives meant to drown out dissent, unify diverse populations, and project an image of invincibility that often bore little resemblance to the truth on the ground. What's truly fascinating, and more than a little unsettling, is how these ancient methods of information control mirror the challenges we face today. In an age of social media algorithms, digital propaganda, and deepfakes, the struggle over whose truth gets heard is as intense as ever. But this is not a new battle. Long before the internet, empires were perfecting the art of narrative manipulation through state-run courier networks, spy reports, and censored mail. They understood something profound. If you control the flow of information, you control how people see the world. And in this video, we're going to pull back the curtain on how they did it. We'll journey along the Persian Royal Road, ride with the messengers of the Mongol Yam, and walk the guarded routes of the Roman Cursus Publicus to uncover the hidden mechanisms these empires used to dominate hearts and minds. You'll discover how something as seemingly mundane as a postal system could decide the fate of rebellions, shape religious orthodoxy, and even alter the course of economies. We'll see how empires used these networks to spread propaganda, suppress competing voices, and create a reality that served their interests, often with devastating consequences for those on the margins. And perhaps most importantly, we'll explore how this history isn't just a relic of the past. The same tactics used by ancient emperors and medieval kings are still in play today, dressed in modern technology but driven by the same hunger for control. So if you've ever wondered where our modern information wars really began, or how truth itself can become a tool in the hands of the powerful, you're in the right place. This is the story of how empires built the first information highways and how they used them to rule the world. Governing an empire spread across thousands of miles, with deserts to cross and mountains to scale, presented a challenge that every ancient ruler had to solve. How do you maintain control when it takes weeks or even months for news to travel from your capital to the farthest reaches of your territory? The answer they arrived at was both simple and revolutionary: build a highway for information. Before these systems existed, a king's command could be distorted by the time it reached a distant governor, or a rumor of rebellion could spread unchecked long before the throne even knew there was a problem. The very stability of an empire depended on closing this gap between command and execution, between the center of power and its outer edges. This urgent, practical need is what gave birth to the world's first imperial postal systems. They were at their heart tools for survival. Initially, these networks served a deeply practical, almost logistical purpose. Imagine you are an emperor. Your armies are engaged on a distant frontier, and you need to send new orders to your generals. A single messenger on a single horse simply isn't reliable enough. The horse could tire, the messenger could fall ill, or bandits could ambush him along a lonely road. The solution was to create a relay system. Stations were built at regular intervals along major routes, each stocked with fresh horses and dedicated riders. A messenger would arrive at one of these stations, hand over his sealed dispatches to a new, well-rested rider, who would then sprint to the next station. This chain of messengers could maintain a blistering pace for days on end, collapsing the vast distances of an empire into a matter of days rather than months. This wasn't just about speed. It was about creating a predictable, reliable flow of information that the state could depend on for everything from moving troops to collecting taxes from remote provinces. But it didn't take long for visionary rulers to realize that this network, built for administration, had a far more potent use. They discovered that whoever controlled this pipeline of information held immense power over the very perception of reality within their borders. If the only news that arrives in a city is an official proclamation of the emperor's latest victory, read aloud by a royal herald, that becomes the truth for the people living there. They have no competing sources, no way to verify the claims. A local uprising could be crushed and then meticulously reframed by the central authority as the defeat of treacherous bandits, rather than a popular revolt. By monopolizing the fastest and most secure communication channels, an empire could ensure that its narrative was the first and often the only one to reach the public. This was the moment the postal system evolved from a mere tool of governance into a powerful instrument of psychological control, setting the stage for everything from sophisticated propaganda campaigns to the systematic silencing of dissent. The foundation for all modern information warfare was laid not in a digital lab, but on the ancient roads where imperial messengers raced against time. To grasp the sheer ambition of the Persian Royal Road, picture a ribbon of packed earth and stone cutting through some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet. This was not a simple path. It was a meticulously engineered highway spanning from the bustling capital of Susa, in what is now Iran, all the way to the wealthy coastal city of Sardis in Lydia, modern-day Turkey. The distance was staggering, over 1,500 miles of mountains, deserts, and plains. For its time, this project was as audacious as building a highway to the moon. And its primary architect, King Darius I, understood that to rule such a vast and diverse collection of cultures and kingdoms, he needed more than just armies and tax collectors. He needed to control time itself, to shrink his empire so that his will could be felt instantaneously in every corner of his domain. The Royal Road was his solution, a physical manifestation of imperial power designed to make the impossible seem routine. The genius of this system lay in its elegant, almost brutal efficiency. Strategically placed along the entire route were 111 relay stations known as stathmoi. Think of these not as rustic inns, but as well-stocked pit stops for the empire's most vital resource, information. At each station, a fresh horse and a rested rider were waiting at all hours, ready for the handoff. A messenger, known as an angaros, would thunder into the station, dismount from his sweating, exhausted animal, and immediately pass his sealed dispatches to the next rider. This new courier would then spring onto a fresh horse and gallop off toward the horizon without a moment's delay. This continuous relay system meant a message could travel the entire length of the road in just 7 days. For an ordinary traveler, the same journey was a grueling 3-month march. This wasn't just fast mail, it was the ancient world's version of a broadband internet connection, and it gave the Persian government an unimaginable strategic advantage. But speed was merely the delivery mechanism for something far more potent: control. The messages racing down that road were carefully curated to project an image of invincible, omniscient authority. Royal decrees, etched into clay or written on parchment, would arrive in distant provinces announcing new laws or the king's latest divine favor. These weren't suggestions, they were pronouncements of reality. Perhaps even more importantly, the road was a two-way street for intelligence. A constant stream of spy reports flowed back to Susa, informing Darius and his advisors about everything from the mood of the local population to the ambitions of regional governors. This flow of information allowed the central government to sniff out dissent before it could blossom into rebellion. If a governor showed signs of disloyalty, a contingent of the king's elite soldiers, the Immortals, could be dispatched with orders that arrived while the plot was still in its infancy. The threat of swift, certain retribution was a powerful deterrent, and it was all made possible by the road. The most profound power the Royal Road wielded, however, was over truth itself. In an age without independent news, the version of events delivered by the King's Herald was the only version most people would ever hear. A military defeat could be reframed as a strategic withdrawal. A harsh new tax could be presented as a necessary measure for the empire's glorious defense. The narrative was meticulously managed, ensuring that the king was always portrayed as wise, just, and favored by the gods. Any competing stories, any whispers of failure or corruption, were easily drowned out by the official, authoritative voice of the state, delivered directly to the town square by a messenger on a royal horse. This control of the narrative was the ultimate glue holding a fractious empire together. It demonstrated, for the first time on such a grand scale, that physical infrastructure could be weaponized not to move armies, but to manage perceptions, to enforce a single, unifying truth that served the interests of those in power. The road itself was the engine, but the information it carried was the fuel for an entire imperial project. If the Persian Royal Road was the prototype, then the Roman Cursus Publicus was the fully realized industrial-grade model. Emperor Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, inherited a republic that had exploded into a sprawling, unwieldy empire, and he knew that the greatest threat to his power wasn't an external enemy. It was the sheer, paralyzing distance between Rome and its provinces. A rebellion could burn for weeks in Gaul before news even reached the capital. His brilliant, ruthless solution was to weave a nervous system directly into the body of the empire. A network so efficient and far-reaching it would become the envy of the world for centuries. He called it the Cursus Publicus, the public way, but there was nothing public about it. This was a privileged, government-only courier service, and it was the ultimate tool for making the vast empire feel small, manageable, and perpetually under the watchful eye of Rome. The physical backbone of this system was, of course, the famous Roman roads. These were not mere dirt paths, they were masterpieces of engineering, built with deep foundations, drainage ditches, and layered stone surfaces that could withstand centuries of use. They arrowed straight across the landscape, cutting through hills and spanning rivers with sturdy bridges, all to shave precious hours off a journey. Along these roads, at intervals of roughly 10 to 15 miles, a typical day's ride, Augustus established way stations called mutations. These were simple stables where a rider could swap his tired horse for a fresh one and be on his way in minutes. Then, every 20 to 25 miles were the larger mansions, which were more like full-service inns. Here, a courier could find a hot meal, a bed for the night, blacksmiths to repair equipment, and even doctors to tend to injuries. This two-tiered system meant that urgent dispatches could fly down the road non-stop, day and night, while official travelers on less pressing business could still move with remarkable speed and security. But the true innovation wasn't just the infrastructure, it was the bureaucracy that powered it. To use the Cursus Publicus, an official needed a special passport called a diploma. issued directly by the emperor or his highest-ranking praetorian prefect. This wasn't a simple letter of introduction. It was a meticulously detailed travel warrant specifying the exact route, the number of horses and carriages authorized, and even the types of supplies the bearer was entitled to at each station. Forging one of these documents was a capital offense. This strict control prevented local officials from abusing the system and ensured that only state-sanctioned information moved along these privileged lanes. The messengers themselves, the cursors and tabularii, were often slaves or freedmen, but they carried the authority of the emperor himself. To hinder one was to challenge the power of Rome, a fact that granted them safe passage even through the most lawless territories. While the system was built for logistics, moving troops, collecting taxes, delivering census data, its most potent function quickly became information control. The Cursus Publicus was the empire's central nervous system, and the brain in Rome was listening to every whisper. A vast web of imperial spies and provincial governors used the network to send confidential reports back to the capital, detailing everything from economic conditions and harvest yields to rumors of discontent or potential usurpers. Special agents, the frumentarii, originally tasked with securing grain supplies, evolved into a secret police force, using the Cursus Publicus to travel swiftly and silently, delivering reports of treason, arresting suspects, and ensuring the emperor's will was enforced. In this way, the postal system became an instrument of surveillance, a means to hear dissent before it could become a shout, and when it came to shaping reality, the Romans were masters. The Cursus Publicus was the primary distribution network for imperial propaganda. Victories on the battlefield, real or exaggerated, were celebrated in elaborate victory bulletins that were rushed to every major city. There, they would be read aloud in the forums, proclaiming the boundless power and divine favor of the emperor. News of a distant plague or famine could be suppressed to prevent panic, while stories of the emperor's generosity, organizing games or distributing grain, were amplified to foster loyalty. In the hands of a skilled propagandist, the system could maintain the glorious illusion of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, even as the empire's borders smoldered with conflict and its internal politics grew increasingly corrupt. The constant, reliable flow of official news created a shared narrative across millions of people, a narrative that consistently reinforced one central idea: resistance was futile and the power of Rome was eternal. The roads may have been public, but the truth traveling on them was very carefully curated. While the Romans built stone roads and the Persians established fixed routes, the Mongols mastered a different kind of terrain. The vast, open steppe, and their postal system, the Yam, was a masterpiece of mobile, ruthless efficiency. Imagine a network that could carry a message from the Danube River in Eastern Europe all the way to the court of the Great Khan in Karakoram, Mongolia, in a matter of weeks. This wasn't just a communication line. It was a central nervous system for the largest contiguous land empire in human history, and its primary purpose was to ensure that the will of one man, whether it was Genghis Khan or his successor, could be felt instantaneously across thousands of miles of conquered territory. The Yam was the ultimate expression of Mongol power, fast, flexible, and utterly terrifying to those who fell under its shadow. The system's architecture was perfectly suited to the nomadic lifestyle of its creators. Instead of permanent stone-way stations, the Yam relied on a series of staging posts, each spaced about a day's ride apart, roughly 20 to 40 miles. But these weren't just simple stables. Each post was a small, self-sufficient community called a Yam, staffed by a local official and housing enough horses, riders, food, and supplies to support the constant flow of messengers. The Mongols maintained hundreds of thousands of horses dedicated solely to this system, ensuring a fresh, powerful mount was always available. The messengers themselves, known as urgetchi or elchai, were chosen for their incredible endurance and unwavering loyalty. They were the empire's elite athletes, trained to ride for days with little food or sleep, often tying themselves to their saddles to avoid falling off from exhaustion. Their speed was legendary. A single rider could cover up to 200 miles in a single day by switching horses at each post, a pace that was simply unimaginable anywhere else in the medieval world. This breathtaking speed, however, served a much darker purpose than mere administrative convenience. The Yam was the primary tool for enforcing Mongol dominance over an incredibly diverse and often rebellious population. The most urgent messages racing along these routes were military orders. If a city on the far western edge of the empire showed signs of revolt, a messenger could streak across the continent to alert the Great Khan. A punitive force of Mongol cavalry could then be dispatched with orders that arrived while the rebellion was still in its infancy. The rebels would barely have time to organize before they saw the dreaded dust cloud of approaching horsemen on the horizon. This ability to project overwhelming force with shocking speed created a powerful psychological weapon, the illusion of the Khan's omnipresence. Subjects came to believe that the Khan could see everything and strike anywhere at any time. This perception of invincibility was often enough to discourage defiance before it even began. Beyond moving armies, the Yam was a sophisticated intelligence-gathering apparatus. A constant stream of spies and scouts, disguised as simple messengers, flowed back to the capital. They reported on everything from the morale of subjugated peoples and the loyalty of local governors to the strength of rival armies and the conditions of trade routes. This gave the Mongol rulers an unparalleled bird's-eye view of their entire empire, allowing them to play a complex game of geopolitical chess, pitting rivals against each other and shoring up weaknesses before they could be exploited. The system also included a clever form of authentication to prevent forgery or interference. Messengers carried a passport of authority called a paisa, typically a bronze or silver tablet inscribed with the Great Khan's seal. To see a rider holding a silver paisa was to understand that he spoke with the absolute authority of the Khan himself. To hinder him was a death sentence for the offender and often their entire family. This combination of brutal enforcement and efficient logistics meant that the official narrative, the story of Mongol invincibility and divine right to rule, was the only story that could travel freely across the empire. Any whisper of dissent, any rumor of a Mongol defeat, was instantly overtaken and crushed by the official truth delivered at a gallop. The Yam wasn't just a mail service. It was a system designed to ensure that across continents and cultures, only one voice could be heard clearly, the voice of the Khan. While the Mongols relied on sheer speed and the Romans on brute force infrastructure, the Byzantine Empire took a radically different approach. They understood that in a world of constant threats surrounded by powerful enemies, raw military strength would never be enough. Their survival for over 1,000 years, long after the Western Roman Empire had crumbled into dust, depended on something far more subtle: the masterful manipulation of information. The Byzantines turned their postal and diplomatic networks into a sophisticated instrument of statecraft, a weapon of psychological warfare where a carefully worded letter could achieve more than a legion of soldiers. For them, the truth was not something to be simply controlled. It was a fluid, malleable tool to be shaped, twisted, and deployed with surgical precision against any foe. At the heart of this system was a relentless focus on secrecy and authentication. The Byzantines lived in perpetual fear of espionage and forged messages, so they developed some of the most advanced cryptographic techniques the world had ever seen. The Imperial Chancery employed teams of clerks who were experts in ciphering. They used complex substitution codes where letters or symbols replaced the real text, and they even developed a primitive form of the one-time pad, where a message was encrypted using a key that was only ever used once and then destroyed. Important dispatches were often written in a special, abbreviated Greek cursive that was nearly impossible for outsiders to decipher. The official responsible for this, the logothete of the course, was one of the most powerful men in the empire because he controlled the literal keys to imperial communication. Without his cipher books, a captured message was just a meaningless collection of squiggles, even if it fell directly into the hands of a hostile king. This obsession with secure communication extended to the messengers themselves. Unlike the large, impersonal relay systems of other empires, the Byzantines relied on a smaller core of highly trusted, professional couriers known as the cursors and the more elite agents in rebus. These men were far more than just mail carriers. They were often trained diplomats, intelligence officers, and spies all rolled into one. They were chosen for their discretion, linguistic skills, and intimate knowledge of foreign courts. Agents in rebus might be dispatched to the court of the Sassanid Persians or the Bulgarian Khans carrying a sealed, encrypted letter, but his real mission was to listen, to observe, to bribe officials, and to gather every scrap of rumor and intelligence he could. Upon his return, his verbal debriefing was often more valuable than the official document he delivered. They were the eyes and ears of the emperor in a hostile world, and the postal network was their bloodstream. The true genius of Byzantine communication, however, lay in its aggressive use of deception. The imperial court were grand masters of disinformation, and they used their control over long-distance messages to weave elaborate lies designed to confound their enemies. A classic tactic was to send multiple, contradictory messages to different recipients. The emperor might send a letter to a Lombard duke professing eternal friendship and promising military support, while simultaneously sending a secret message to the duke's rival, encouraging him to attack with a vague promise that Byzantium would look the other way. The goal was to keep potential adversaries perpetually off balance, distrustful of each other, and forever seeking favor from Constantinople. They would forge letters from enemy rulers to sow dissent within their ranks or leak false information about the movement of Byzantine armies to lure foes into ambushes. The postal system allowed them to conduct this symphony of lies across the entire Mediterranean basin. Perhaps their most enduring strategy was the use of diplomacy as theater, all coordinated through meticulous correspondence. The Byzantines rarely sought the total annihilation of an enemy. They preferred to turn them into a dependent ally. They would use flattering letters, extravagant titles, and promises of lavish gifts to inflate the ego of a barbarian chieftain, effectively bribing him into becoming a client king. A steady stream of correspondence would then follow, laden with condescending advice and veiled threats, reminding the chieftain where his power and legitimacy truly came from. This system of controlled information flow allowed a relatively small empire to manage a vast network of vassal states on its borders, using perception and prestige as its primary currencies. The constant, curated communication created a reality where Byzantine influence seemed far greater and more omnipresent than it truly was. In the end, the Byzantine postal network proved that the most powerful empire isn't always the one with the biggest army, but the one that most skillfully controls the story everyone else believes. While the Byzantines were masters of deception, the Islamic caliphates, particularly under the visionary Abbasid dynasty, pursued a more complex and seemingly contradictory goal. They built a postal system designed not just to control truth, but to simultaneously cultivate and contain it. The Abbasid Barid, a name derived from the word for post horse, became the circulatory system for a golden age of knowledge, yet its lifeblood was always carefully filtered by the heart of caliphal power. This created a fascinating paradox: an empire that actively funded the translation of Greek philosophy, Persian astronomy, and Indian mathematics into Arabic, creating an unprecedented repository of human understanding, while also ensuring that this very flow of information never threatened the religious and political authority at its core. The Barid was the physical mechanism that made both this enlightenment and this control possible. The scale and sophistication of the Barid were breathtaking, a direct reflection of the Abbasid Caliphate's immense wealth and administrative genius. Established more formally around the 8th century, its network of routes spiderwebbed out from the dazzling new capital of Baghdad, reaching to the edges of the empire in Spain, North Africa, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. At its heart was a system of way stations, or sikha, positioned at regular intervals along major trade and pilgrimage routes. Each station was staffed with attendants, fresh horses, and even veterinarians to ensure the animals remained in peak condition. Couriers, known as al-Barid, were highly trained and enjoyed a privileged status, their speed and reliability legendary. A message could travel from the far western province of Al-Andalus to the caliph's court in a matter of weeks, a feat that allowed the central government to feel connected to its most distant territories in a way that was previously unimaginable. This infrastructure was the envy of the world, a tangible symbol of Islamic advancement. This incredible speed first served a noble and transformative purpose: the rapid exchange of knowledge. The Barid was the engine behind the famed House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the world's greatest intellectual center at the time. Scholars in Cairo or Damascus could send requests for specific texts to libraries in Persia. Translators in Baghdad could receive newly acquired Greek manuscripts from Byzantine monasteries and send their completed Arabic versions to academics in Cordoba. Astronomical observations, medical discoveries, and mathematical theorems could be shared, debated, and refined across continents. The Barid didn't just carry administrative decrees, it carried the very ideas that fueled the Islamic Golden Age, creating a shared intellectual space that stretched for thousands of miles. It was in many ways the first global network for scholarly collaboration. Yet this celebrated flow of knowledge was inextricably linked to the caliph's need for control. The same courier who delivered a precious philosophical text to a scholar could also be carrying a secret report on that very scholar's political loyalties from the local governor. The Barid's primary official function was as an intelligence-gathering service for the state. Its director, the Sahib al-Barid, was one of the most powerful and feared officials in the empire, answering directly to the caliph. His agents were embedded throughout the network, tasked with monitoring everything. They watched regional governors for any sign of disloyalty or corruption, sending encrypted reports back to Baghdad that could lead to a governor's sudden dismissal or arrest. They tracked the collection of taxes, ensuring that the empire's financial lifeblood was not being siphoned off by local elites. The system was the caliph's window into every corner of his domain, a panopticon built not with bricks but with information. This surveillance extended fiercely into the realm of religious orthodoxy. The Abbasid Caliph was both a political and a religious leader, the defender of the faith. The Barid became a crucial tool for imposing a unified Sunni Islamic doctrine across a vast and theologically diverse empire. Heretical movements, like those of the Mu'tazilites or various Shia sects, were seen as existential threats to unity. The postal network allowed the central religious authorities in Baghdad to keep a close watch on preachers and judges in distant provinces. If a local judge began issuing legal opinions that strayed from official doctrine, a corrective missive, backed by the full authority of the caliph, could be rushed to him via the Barid. In extreme cases, orders for the suppression of a heretical group could be dispatched with terrifying speed, long before the movement could gain a foothold. The Barid ensured that the caliph's version of Islamic truth was the one that prevailed in mosques and courts from the Nile to the Oxus River, proving that the control of sacred truth was just as vital as the control of its secular counterpart. While the vast, centralized empires of the East relied on sprawling, state-funded relay networks, the story in medieval Europe was one of fragmentation and fierce competition for control. Here, power was not consolidated under a single emperor but dispersed among a patchwork of kings, dukes, popes, and city-states, all vying for influence over a continent where literacy was a rare privilege and rumors could topple thrones. In this volatile landscape, controlling the flow of information wasn't just a luxury of power, it was the very essence of survival. European monarchs and popes couldn't build roads like the Romans. Instead, they built something far more personal and clandestine, networks of trust sealed with wax and carried by hand. Their postal systems were less about breathtaking speed and more about absolute secrecy, becoming the hidden weapons in a relentless, continent-wide struggle for hearts and minds. The most powerful symbol of this control was the humble wax seal. In an age where most people couldn't read, the visual authority of a seal was everything. A letter bearing the royal seal of the King of France or the papal bulla of the Pope wasn't just a message, it was a physical extension of the ruler's will and authority. The process of sealing was a ritual of state. Hot wax would be dripped onto the folded parchment, and then a metal matrix, intricately carved with the ruler's unique insignia, a fleur de lis, an imperial eagle. The keys of St. Peter would be pressed into it, leaving an unmistakable mark. To break this seal without authorization was a treasonous act, often punishable by death. This wasn't just about preventing prying eyes, it was about authenticating reality itself. A sealed order could raise an army, condemn a noble to the dungeon, or transfer vast tracts of land, and its power was derived entirely from that small disk of wax. The seal was the password, the encryption key, and the royal signature all in one, making the document it held the official and uncontestable truth. But a sealed letter is useless without a trusted pair of hands to carry it. This gave rise to a new class of power broker, the royal messenger. These were not anonymous riders in a relay but often high-ranking members of the court, chosen for their personal loyalty and discretion. A king would entrust his most sensitive missions to his chaplain, a favored knight, or even a family member. These messengers were diplomats, negotiators, and spies all rolled into one. They carried letters detailing marriage alliances, plans for military campaigns, or secret treaties, and they were often empowered to speak on the monarch's behalf, adding nuance and persuasion that parchment alone could not convey. Their safe passage was considered sacrosanct under the laws of nations and the church, but this was often honored in the breach. Ambushing a rival's messenger to steal his dispatches was a common, if risky, tactic in the shadow war between medieval powers. The life of a messenger was one of constant peril, navigating not just bad roads and bandits, but the even more dangerous currents of courtly intrigue. No institution mastered this dark art of information control better than the Papal Curia in Rome. The Catholic Church operated the most sophisticated and far-reaching postal network in medieval Europe, a spiderweb of routes connecting the Vatican to bishops, abbots, and kings in every corner of Christendom. This system was the ultimate tool for projecting soft power. Through a constant stream of papal bulls, encyclicals, and letters, the Pope could dictate theological doctrine, settle doctrinal disputes, and appoint bishops loyal to Rome, effectively ensuring a unified Catholic front across a fractured continent. But the network had a sharper, more sinister edge. It was also the primary mechanism for punishment and mobilization. A messenger arriving at a royal court with a letter bearing the papal seal could deliver the most feared sentence in the medieval world: excommunication. This wasn't just a religious penalty, it was a political and social death sentence, stripping a king of his divine right to rule and turning his subjects and allies against him. With the same efficiency, the couriers network could distribute calls for a new crusade, weaving a narrative of holy war that could unite thousands of knights from rival nations under a single banner. The Pope, from his desk in Rome, could shape the destiny of empires simply by controlling the couriers who left his gates. Yet, the very importance of these sealed messages also made them a potent tool for deception. In the absence of any way to verify information, forgery became a high-stakes art form. Rivals could forge letters to frame their enemies for treason, using skilled scribes to mimic handwriting and even counterfeit seals. A cleverly crafted fake document could start a war or end a dynasty. Similarly, the strategic leaking of information or misinformation was a common tactic. A king might have his messengers spread rumors of his army's immense size or an impending alliance in the taverns and town squares along their route, knowing that this gossip would race ahead of them and weaken the enemy's resolve before a single sword was even drawn. In this environment, the truth was often just the version of events that arrived first, delivered with the most convincing authority. The control of the postal system meant you could not only tell your own story, but also write the ending for your rivals, crafting a narrative of their treachery or weakness that would be accepted as fact long before they could tell their side of the tale. Behind every royal seal, every encrypted scroll, and every galloping horse was a single, indispensable individual, the Imperial courier. These men were the living, breathing engine of the entire information empire, the critical human link upon which everything depended. They weren't just employees, they were extensions of the ruler's own will, chosen through a ruthless process that prized three qualities above all else: unwavering loyalty, superhuman endurance, and absolute discretion. A fast rider was easy to find, but a man who would rather die than reveal a secret to his torturers, or who could ride for 3 days with little sleep through a blizzard to deliver a message that might prevent a war, that was a treasure beyond price. Empires invested immense trust in these individuals, for they understood that the most secure system in the world was worthless if the person carrying its secrets could be bribed, bullied, or broken. The life of a top-tier courier, such as a Mongol Urgetchi or a Byzantine agents in Rebus, was one of extreme privilege and even more extreme pressure. They enjoyed a status that set them apart from ordinary soldiers and citizens. A courier carrying the silver paisa of the Great Khan could commandeer any horse, demand food and lodging from any household, and expect immediate, unquestioning obedience from local officials across the empire. To refuse him was to refuse the Khan himself, a crime punishable by death. In Rome, messengers of the Cursus Publicus carried a diploma that granted them access to the empire's best resources, bypassing the struggles of ordinary travel. This privileged access wasn't a reward, it was a strategic necessity. It ensured that nothing, not a greedy local official, not a suspicious innkeeper, not a broken axle, could delay the vital flow of information. The message was everything, and the courier was its sacred vessel. But with this great privilege came an even greater burden of responsibility. The penalty for failure was not merely being fired, it was often a horrifying death. If a messenger lost his dispatches to bandits, or if his horse stumbled and he arrived too late to prevent a disaster, he could be executed for his failure. Betrayal was treated with even more savage creativity. There are accounts from the Mongol Empire of messengers suspected of spying being sewn into heavy felt carpets and then trampled by horses, a brutal end designed to send a clear message to others about the cost of disloyalty. This constant balance of extreme reward and extreme punishment created a powerful psychological bond. The courier's identity became fused with his mission. His survival and his success were one and the same, making him a fanatically dedicated agent of the state. Their role, however, went far beyond simple delivery. The most trusted couriers were the empire's eyes and ears, amateur spies tasked with observing everything they saw on their journeys. A Byzantine messenger traveling through Anatolia would note the mood of the local population, the condition of fortifications, and the size of garrison forces, reporting it all verbally upon his return. A Persian angaros might be debriefed on the loyalty of a satrap he delivered a message to, his observations providing a crucial double check on the official reports. They were a mobile intelligence network, their constant travel providing a real-time snapshot of the empire's health that no stationary official could ever hope to compile. The information they carried in their heads was often as valuable as the sealed scrolls in their pouches. This immense responsibility required a unique kind of individual, one who could be both incredibly resilient and completely invisible. They had to possess the physical toughness of a soldier, capable of enduring harsh weather, rough terrain, and long periods without proper rest. Yet they also needed the subtlety of a diplomat and the observational skills of a scout. They had to blend into the background when necessary, overhearing conversations without drawing attention, yet also project immense authority when demanding fresh horses from a reluctant station master. They were shapeshifters, alternating between the roles of humble traveler and imperial herald as the situation demanded. The entire sprawling, magnificent architecture of imperial communication, the roads, the relay stations, the codes ultimately rested on the shoulders of these individuals. Their unwavering commitment is what turned a theoretical network of routes into a living, breathing instrument of power, proving that control over truth has always depended, first and foremost, on the trustworthiness of the human messenger. The sealed scroll, the trusted courier, the galloping horse, these were the visible parts of the imperial postal machine. But for every message that raced down these official channels, there was a hidden, parallel system working just as diligently, the machinery of censorship and surveillance. Empires understood that building a highway for information was only half the battle. The other half was controlling every single thing that traveled on it. From the moment these networks were conceived, they were designed not just for delivery but for interception. The ability to peer into the private correspondence of subjects, governors, and even family members was considered a fundamental right of rule, a necessary tool to sniff out disloyalty before it could blossom into open rebellion. This wasn't a dark, secretive afterthought. It was openly baked into the very architecture of imperial communication, a clear signal that no message was ever truly private when it passed through the hands of the state. To achieve this, empires developed a sophisticated toolkit of surveillance that would feel eerily familiar today. The most straightforward method was the physical checkpoint. Along the Persian Royal Road and the Roman Cursus Publicus, officials manned way stations that served as both rest stops and inspection points. Here, a courier might be required to present his travel warrant, and while his horse was being swapped, his message bag could be subject to a cursory, or sometimes very thorough, examination. Seals could be carefully softened with steam and lifted, messages could be read and copied by swift scribes, and then everything could be resealed and sent on its way, with the sender and recipient none the wiser. For messages deemed suspicious or dangerous, the outcome was far more final. They would simply disappear, lost to bandits or bad weather. their contents never reaching their intended destination and their senders often meeting a mysterious and abrupt end. Beyond random checks, many empires employed a dedicated class of official whose sole job was to read other people's mail. In ancient China, the Qin dynasty, famous for its legalist and ruthlessly efficient bureaucracy, institutionalized this practice to an astonishing degree. Officials known as giantcha were posted at key communication hubs. Their duty was to open and scrutinize a significant portion of the correspondence flowing through the region, looking for keywords or phrases that hinted at sedition, criticism of the emperor, or plots against the state. They weren't just looking for obvious treason. They were trained to read between the lines, to interpret poetic allegory or historical references that might be used as coded criticism. A seemingly innocent poem about a wilted flower could be interpreted as a metaphor for a declining emperor, landing its author in a world of trouble. This system created a culture of profound self-censorship, where people were afraid to put anything in writing, effectively silencing dissent before it was even uttered. Perhaps the most fascinating and ingenious system of information control came from the Inca Empire in South America, which managed its vast territories without a written script as we know it. Instead, they used the quipu, a complex device made of colored cords with a series of knots. For a long time, these were thought to be simple accounting tools, a way to record numerical data like tax obligations or census numbers. But recent scholarship suggests their use was far more nuanced and powerful. The quipu was in essence a three-dimensional, tactile language. The colors of the cords, the types of knots, their position on the string, and even the direction of the twist in the fibers could all convey specific information. Crucially, only a specially trained class of officials, the quipukamayaks, knew how to read and create these devices. This system was the ultimate form of controlled information. Imagine a provincial governor wanting to send a report to the Sapa Inca in Cuzco. He couldn't simply write a letter detailing local grievances or a rival's popularity. He had to convey his message through the strictly formalized, pre-approved medium of the quipu. The quipukamayok translating his words would encode them into this knot-based language, but the format itself naturally limited what could be said. It was brilliant bureaucratic censorship built directly into the technology of communication. The state maintained a monopoly on both the means of communication and its interpretation. A dissenting message couldn't even be formed, let alone sent, because there was no way to encode it within the rigid, state-controlled structure of the quipu. It ensured that only pre-authorized types of information, tax records, troop numbers, inventory lists, could flow to the capital, presenting a sanitized, manageable version of reality to the rulers. These widespread practices from Rome to the Andes reveal a universal truth for ancient empires. Censorship was not a reactive measure. It wasn't something they turned to only when a crisis emerged. It was a proactive, permanent, and foundational pillar of state security. The goal was to create what we would now call a chilling effect, a pervasive atmosphere of fear and watchfulness that encouraged people to police their own thoughts and words. Knowing that any letter could be opened and read by government agents made people hesitate before committing any criticism to paper. This self-censorship was far more effective and efficient than arresting thousands of people after the fact. It allowed the empire to maintain a pristine, official narrative, one where the emperor was always wise, the borders were always secure, and the people were always loyal. Any whisper of contradiction was simply lost in the system, intercepted and silenced long before it could reach another pair of ears and challenge the carefully constructed truth of those in power. Suppressing dissent was only half the battle for history's great empires. The other, more potent half was flooding the public consciousness with a version of reality so compelling and omnipresent that it became the only truth that mattered. This was the birth of state-sponsored propaganda, and the imperial postal system was its most powerful loudspeaker. These networks did far more than just carry administrative orders. They became the primary distribution channel for a carefully crafted narrative designed to shape hearts and minds on a continental scale. Imagine living in a distant Roman province where your only source of news about the wider world is the official proclamation read aloud in the forum by a government herald. You hear of glorious victories on the frontier, of the emperor's boundless generosity in funding new games and distributing grain, and of the divine favor that shines upon the empire. What you don't hear are the defeats, the corruption scandals, or the voices of those who criticize the throne. This curated flow of information wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate and sophisticated strategy to manufacture consent and foster a loyalty that was as much emotional as it was enforced. The Romans were the undisputed masters of this art. The Cursus Publicus, that marvel of logistical efficiency, was repurposed into the world's first mass propaganda machine. Its writers carried beautifully inscribed victory bulletins, known as acta diurna, to every corner of the empire. These documents would announce a military success in Germania or Parthia, but the reporting was never a simple, dry account of events. It was a theatrical performance on parchment, meticulously designed to maximize political impact. The number of enemy casualties would be wildly exaggerated. The tactical genius of the emperor would be praised, even if he had been hundreds of miles away from the actual fighting. The narrative was always one of unstoppable Roman power and divine destiny. For the average citizen, this constant drumbeat of triumph created a powerful psychological effect, the sense that resistance was not just dangerous but utterly futile. Why would you even think of rebelling against a state that the gods themselves seemed to favor, and that crushed all opposition with such effortless ease? This illusion of invincibility was a far cheaper and more effective way to maintain control than stationing legions in every single town. This propaganda wasn't limited to just boasting about military might. It also actively sold the idea of imperial benevolence. The postal network was used to disseminate news of the emperor's great works, the inauguration of a new aqueduct, the funding of a public bathhouse, or the organization of a months-long festival with free bread and chariot races. These announcements were crafted to create a personal bond of gratitude between the subject and the ruler, a feeling that the emperor was a generous father figure providing for his children. This carefully managed image helped to paper over the realities of heavy taxation, political repression, and social inequality. By controlling the narrative, the state could ensure that its occasional acts of generosity were magnified and celebrated, while its constant extraction of resources was downplayed or framed as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. The postal system ensured that this carefully crafted story of a golden age, the Pax Romana, reached everyone simultaneously, creating a shared, empire-wide reality that benefited the powerful. The same tactics were employed with brilliant effect by other empires, each adapting the tool to their specific cultural needs. In Persia, royal inscriptions detailing the king's divine right to rule and his heroic deeds were not just carved into stone monuments. Copies were made and distributed via the royal road to be read aloud by satraps in distant provinces. This wasn't just news, it was a recurring reminder of the cosmic order with the king at its center. The Islamic caliphates used the Barid system to distribute religious edicts and legal rulings from the caliph and his senior scholars. This created a unified religious orthodoxy across millions of people, ensuring that the version of Islam practiced in Spain was the same as that taught in Baghdad. directly reinforcing the caliph's authority as both a political and spiritual leader. The message was clear: there is one truth, one law, and one source of authority, and it all flows from the center through the trusted channels of the state postal system. This early form of information control proves a timeless principle. Those who tell the stories, who get to define what is true and what is important, ultimately hold the greatest power of all. While controlling the narrative of military victories and religious doctrine was crucial, the truly sophisticated empires realized that information was the ultimate currency, and the postal system was their most powerful tool for dominating not just minds, but markets. The flow of commercial intelligence, news of harvests, commodity prices, ship arrivals, and political instability abroad could make or break entire economies. By seizing control of this flow, a state could orchestrate economic outcomes with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra, ensuring that wealth accumulated precisely where they wanted it to, in the imperial treasury. This wasn't merely about gathering intelligence. It was about actively creating information asymmetries where the state and its favored allies always had the advantage, turning the entire economic landscape into a rigged game. No one played this game better than the merchant princes of the Venetian Republic. In the cutthroat world of medieval Mediterranean trade, where fortunes were made and lost on the timing of a single galley's arrival, information was more valuable than gold. Venice responded by building one of the most efficient and feared private intelligence networks in history, a courier system that was the envy of kings. Their messengers, traveling on fast ships and along secure alpine routes, were not carrying love letters. They were delivering the equivalent of modern-day stock tips. A Venetian merchant in Alexandria could learn of a poor spice harvest in India weeks before his Genoese rival, allowing him to buy up existing stocks and create an artificial shortage, driving prices to staggering heights. The Council of Ten, the shadowy ruling body of Venice, used this network to monitor not only foreign threats but the economic activities of its own citizens, ensuring that no individual merchant became powerful enough to challenge the state's authority. The Venetian postal system was a weapon of economic warfare, and it gave the Serene Republic an unbeatable edge for centuries. This manipulation extended far beyond simple insider trading. Empires used their control over communication to grant de facto monopolies to loyal allies. Imagine a Persian king learning through his network of spies and messengers that a particular region had discovered a new vein of lapis lazuli, a brilliant blue stone highly prized by royalty. Instead of this news being public knowledge, the information could be kept secret, and a royal decree, delivered swiftly via the Royal Road, could grant exclusive mining and trading rights to a merchant house that generously funded the crown. The competition was simply shut out before they even knew there was a race to be run. Similarly, the Roman Cursus Publicus could be used to rush orders to provincial governors, instructing them to purchase vast quantities of grain at a fixed, low price before the local farmers even heard about a poor harvest in a neighboring province that had suddenly driven up the value of their crops. The farmers, isolated and without their own sources of information, would have no choice but to sell at the state's price, their potential profit seamlessly transferred into imperial coffers. Perhaps the most impactful form of economic control was the suppression of information to prevent competition altogether. The Spanish Empire, upon establishing its colonies in the Americas, went to great lengths to hide the true scale of silver and gold flowing from mines like Potosi. Official correspondents traveling on the galleons of the Carrera de Indias would downplay output to avoid attracting the attention of rival European powers. More importantly, this secrecy allowed the crown to maintain a stranglehold on the entire economy. By controlling the only reliable channel of long-distance information, they could prevent colonists from establishing direct trade relationships with other European nations. A merchant in Mexico City might hear a rumor that English wool was available at a far better price than Spanish goods, but without the ability to verify this information or communicate directly with an English supplier, he was powerless. He remained utterly dependent on the inflated prices and limited selection offered by merchants sanctioned by the Spanish crown. The postal monopoly enforced an economic dependency as rigid as any law, binding the colonies to the mother country not just by rule of law, but by a deliberate and enforced ignorance. The truth about market prices, alternative goods, and better opportunities was systematically filtered out, leaving entire economies captive to the whims of a distant imperial power. Yet the power to spread a unified faith was also the power to extinguish diversity. For every bishop who received a clarifying doctrine, there was a local priest whose traditional practices were now deemed heretical and ordered to cease. For every community that received the approved text of the Quran, there was a village where unique interpretations of Islam that had developed in relative isolation were now suppressed by the authority of the distant caliph. The postal system in these instances became a tool of cultural and religious homogenization. It allowed a central religious authority to reach directly into a remote monastery or a rural mosque and enforce conformity with a rigidity that was previously impossible. The very efficiency of these networks meant that local religious autonomy, with all its beautiful and idiosyncratic variations, could be systematically dismantled and replaced with a single, approved orthodoxy. The battle for souls had always been waged, but now it could be directed with the precision of a general moving pins on a map, thanks to the couriers who carried the ultimate orders. The relentless drive for faster, more secure communication sparked a technological arms race among ancient empires, each innovation subtly shifting the balance of power in the eternal struggle to control truth. While the backbone of every postal system remained the humble horse and rider, it was the relentless refinement of these elements that transformed them from simple messengers into instruments of imperial will. Breeding programs became matters of state security, with empires investing fortunes to develop equine bloodlines prized for incredible speed, stamina, and the ability to thrive in specific terrains. The famed Arabian horses of the caliphates, known for their endurance in the desert heat, were as much a technological advantage as a steed. Similarly, the hardy ponies of the Mongol steppes could traverse frozen ground and high mountain passes that would stop other armies cold. This wasn't just animal husbandry, it was the cutting-edge logistics of its day, ensuring that the emperor's word could outpace any rival version of events. But a fast horse is useless without a clear path to run. This understanding led to some of the most staggering infrastructure projects the ancient world would ever see. The Roman roads, built with their characteristic deep stone foundations and expertly engineered cambers for drainage, were so well constructed that many are still in use today. They were the information superhighways of their era, allowing messengers to maintain a consistent, high speed regardless of weather. The Persians took this a step further, not only paving their royal road but also building bridges across chasms and carving tunnels through mountains to keep the route as direct as possible. This obsession with directness was about more than efficiency. A winding road through a valley was easier to ambush than a straight, elevated highway that could be watched for miles. Every stone laid was a statement of control, physically etching the empire's authority onto the landscape and ensuring its narrative could flow without obstruction. The most fascinating innovations, however, emerged in the realm of security. As empires grew more sophisticated, so did the threats to their communication. The simple sealed letter was no longer enough. The Byzantines, paranoid about the constant threat of espionage, became pioneers of cryptography. They developed the first known cipher disks, concentric circles of bronze or wood with alphabets engraved on them. By turning the inner disk to a predetermined alignment, a scribe could transcribe a message into a seemingly random string of letters. Only a recipient with an identical disk set to the same key could read it. For even greater security, they employed steganography, the art of hiding a message's very existence. A seemingly innocent love poem or a mundane merchant's invoice might be written in a special ink between the lines, visible only when heated over a candle or treated with a specific chemical. An empire's most sensitive truths could travel in plain sight, hidden from all but the intended eyes. Authentication was another critical frontier. How could a distant official be sure that the dusty, exhausted man demanding fresh horses and proclaiming a royal decree was truly a messenger and not a clever impostor? The Mongols solved this with elegant brutality through the paisa. This was not a simple piece of parchment. It was a tablet of authority, typically made of wood, silver, or even gold for the most important envoys. Inscribed with the Great Khan's unique seal, often a falcon or a tiger, the paisa functioned as a visual and tactile passport. Its weight, craftsmanship, and unmistakable symbolism were nearly impossible to forge. Presenting a silver paisa granted the bearer absolute priority for resources, safe passage through any territory, and the immediate obedience of any local official. To see one was to understand that the bearer was an extension of the Khan's own will. The technology was simple, but its psychological impact was profound, transforming a lone rider into an unstoppable force of imperial authority. These technological leaps did more than just speed up mail delivery. They fundamentally altered the calculus of power. The combination of faster horses, better roads, and secure communication created an information advantage that was almost insurmountable. An empire could learn of a rebellion, dispatch orders to mobilize a loyal army, and have that army on the move before the rebels even realized their plot had been discovered. This ability to act on information while an opponent was still in the dark was the ultimate strategic weapon. It allowed empires to project an image of omniscience, as if the rulers truly had gods whispering in their ears. The constant, visible improvement of the postal system, faster riders, more secure messages, more impressive credentials, was itself a form of propaganda, a dazzling display of technological superiority designed to convince both subjects and rivals that the empire was not just powerful, but inevitably, eternally so. In the end, the history of these innovations reveals a timeless lesson. The tools we use to share information are never neutral. They are always inevitably shaped by the desire to control what is shared, and with them, we shape the very reality people believe in. Yet for all their imposing infrastructure and ruthless efficiency, these imperial postal systems were never the impenetrable fortresses of control they were designed to be. Wherever there is a monopoly on truth, a black market for information inevitably springs up in its shadow. The human desire to communicate freely, to share forbidden knowledge, and to challenge authority proved to be an unstoppable force, constantly inventing ingenious ways to slip through the cracks of even the most watchful state. This was a silent war waged not with swords but with smuggled letters, hidden symbols, and clandestine networks, proving that the flow of truth could be slowed but never completely dammed. In the darkest days of the Roman Empire, under the threat of brutal persecution, early Christians became masters of this underground art. They couldn't use the official Cursus Publicus. To do so would be to deliver themselves directly to their persecutors. Instead, they built a whisper network of trusted followers who carried messages tucked into their robes or hidden in shipments of everyday goods. they developed a secret visual language to evade detection, using simple symbols scratched onto walls or carved into signet rings to communicate safely. The image of a fish, the Greek word for which was an acronym for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior, became a covert way to identify allies and mark safe houses. A shepherd's crook might be discreetly drawn near a door to indicate a home where followers could gather. These weren't just messages, they were lifelines, and their successful delivery relied on a level of personal trust and commitment that no state-mandated system could ever hope to command or corrupt. This spirit of entrepreneurial defiance flourished in the merchant classes of medieval Europe. Kings and popes might have held a monopoly on official communication, but they could not control the relentless human drive for commerce. Frustrated by the slow, expensive, and often censored royal postal services, powerful guilds and wealthy trading families began to establish their own private courier networks. The Medici Bank, with branches stretching from Florence to London, operated a famously efficient and discreet system of messengers who carried financial information, market prices, and letters of credit. This private pipeline of economic intelligence gave them a colossal advantage, allowing them to make moves on the international money markets while their competitors were still waiting for official news to trickle through. For these merchants, bypassing the royal post wasn't an act of political rebellion. It was simply good business. In doing so, however, they created an alternative information ecosystem that lay outside the crown's control, a space where a different kind of truth, the truth of profit, loss, and opportunity, could flow freely. Perhaps the most audacious acts of subversion came from within the systems themselves. The very couriers entrusted with carrying the empire's secrets sometimes became the weakest link in its chain of control. A heavily guarded scroll intended for a provincial governor might be secretly opened and read by a disgruntled or curious messenger long before it reached its destination. In an age before photocopiers, the most a spy could do was memorize the contents and report them to his true masters, but the damage was done. There are accounts from the Mongol Empire of messengers being bribed by rival princes to delay critical military orders, effectively altering the outcome of a distant power struggle without ever drawing a sword. The Byzantine Empire, for all its cryptographic genius, was perpetually plagued by paranoia about its own agents in reviews selling secrets to foreign powers. This demonstrated a fundamental flaw in any system built on human labor. You could threaten a messenger with death for betrayal, but you could never completely eliminate the risk of a well-placed bribe, a moment of ideological sympathy, or simple human error. The state's most trusted agents could, in a heartbeat, become its most dangerous vulnerabilities. These countless acts of resistance, from the whispered password to the merchant's private ledger, reveal a profound and enduring truth. The history of information control is not a simple story of powerful states imposing their will upon a passive populace. It is a dynamic and endless struggle, a dance between imposition and evasion. For every new method of surveillance, a new technique of secrecy was invented. For every official channel, an unofficial bypass was carved out. This struggle reminds us that the human spirit is inherently resistant to being silenced, and that the desire to share our own truths in our own ways is one of the most powerful and persistent forces in history. Yet for all the meticulous control and deliberate censorship, these imperial communication networks had a curious and powerful side effect that their creators never intended. In their relentless drive to consolidate power, empires had accidentally built the world's first grand concourses for the free exchange of ideas. The very roads and relay stations designed to carry the singular, authoritative voice of the emperor began to hum with a vibrant, uncontrollable chorus of other voices. Alongside the royal decrees and military orders, these channels began to carry something far more subversive: new philosophies, foreign art, scientific discoveries, and religious beliefs that often directly challenged the official doctrines the systems were built to enforce. The tightly controlled pipeline of information began to leak, and through those cracks flowed the very things that could unravel an empire's carefully woven narrative of uniformity and absolute authority. Consider the humble merchant traveling under the protection of the Persian Royal Road. His cart might be filled with silks and spices, but tucked among his wares could be something far more dangerous: a clay tablet or a scroll containing the teachings of a radical new philosopher, or the religious texts of a minority sect. A Byzantine diplomat journeying with his encrypted messages to a foreign court might engage in long conversations with scholars he met at a Mancio way station, exchanging ideas about medicine, astronomy, or geometry that were completely unknown in his homeland. The Mongol Yam, while primarily a tool for military command, also transported scribes, doctors, and artisans between the different khanates. These individuals didn't just bring their skills, they brought their cultural perspectives, their unique artistic styles, and their worldviews, which then blended with local traditions in unexpected and innovative ways. The infrastructure of control had inadvertently become a catalyst for cultural pollination on a massive scale. The most famous example of this phenomenon isn't a formal postal system at all, but it operated on the exact same principles: the Silk Road. This sprawling network of trade routes, which the empires actively protected and maintained for commercial reasons, functioned as a superhighway for cultural exchange. Buddhist monks from India traveled along these routes into Central Asia and China, carrying their spiritual teachings with them. Their ideas didn't just stay in monasteries, they seeped into local beliefs, creating new syncretic forms of worship that bore little resemblance to the orthodoxies of either the Indian or Chinese empires. Technologies, once the closely guarded secrets of a single civilization, began to diffuse. The Chinese knowledge of papermaking, a state secret for centuries, slowly traveled west, eventually reaching the Islamic world and then Europe, where it would revolutionize record-keeping and, ironically, make censorship far more difficult for future rulers. The compass, gunpowder, and advanced agricultural techniques all followed similar paths, escaping the control of their originators and altering the balance of power across continents. This uncontrolled flow of information often posed a direct threat to the imperial narratives these networks were meant to uphold. A Roman citizen in a provincial town might hear the official proclamation of the emperor's divinity from a state herald, but later that evening, in the crowded tavern near the Postal way station, he might overhear a traveling scholar from the East debating the nature of the soul with a local philosopher, presenting a worldview that had no place for a divine emperor. The Islamic caliphates used the Bawrid to enforce Sunni orthodoxy, yet the same network that carried the caliph's rulings also carried the texts of Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato. These works, once translated in Baghdad's House of Wisdom, introduced methods of rational inquiry and logic that could be, and were, used to question religious dogma and political authority. The system designed to spread a single truth was simultaneously distributing the intellectual tools to dismantle it. This is the great irony and the enduring lesson of these ancient information networks. In their quest for absolute control, empires had created the means for their own eventual challenge. They had built a system that could not be perfectly contained. Information, once set into motion, is like water. It finds its own level, it seeps through the smallest cracks, and it eventually nourishes landscapes far beyond the control of those who first channeled it. The postal roads and relay stations stood as monuments to imperial power. but they also became the very arteries through which the diverse, complicated, and uncontrollable lifeblood of human culture continued to pulse, reminding us that the desire to connect and share ideas is a force even more powerful than the will to dominate. The echoes of those galloping hooves and the rustle of sealed scrolls did not fade with the fall of ancient empires. Instead, they were woven directly into the fabric of our modern world. The organizational blueprints first drafted by Persian kings and Roman emperors became the foundational code for the national postal services we take for granted today. When you drop a letter into a mailbox, you are participating in a ritual of state-controlled communication that began over 2 millennia ago. The very idea of a universal service, with standardized rates and routes managed by a central authority, is a direct inheritance from the Cursus Publicus and the Abbasid. These empires established the principle that efficient communication was a public good, but also a state monopoly, a duality that continues to define our relationship with information networks to this very day. Beyond the mailman, the shadowy world of intelligence gathering owes its entire operational philosophy to these ancient systems. The elaborate spy networks of the Byzantine Empire, with their encrypted messages and trusted couriers, were the proto-CIA or MI6. The concept of running a network of informants who report back to a central hub via secure channels, of intercepting and deciphering the correspondence of rivals, of using diplomats as covers for intelligence officers, these are not modern inventions. They are time-tested tactics refined in the imperial courts of Constantinople and Baghdad. The modern intelligence agency is simply the Yam or the Cursus Publicus equipped with satellites and digital encryption, but its core mission remains unchanged: to see everything, know everything, and ensure the Home Office maintains its information advantage. Perhaps the most profound legacy, however, lies in the digital realm. The architects of the early internet, whether they realized it or not, were building a new kind of informational empire, and they instinctively reached for models of organization that ensured control and efficiency. The fundamental protocol of the internet, TCP/IP, which breaks data into packets and routes them efficiently across a network to be reassembled at their destination, is a stunning digital reimagining of the Persian relay system. A data packet hopping from router to router is the direct descendant of a Persian Angaros swapping his tired horse for a fresh one at a Stathmoy, both systems designed for speed and reliability over complex, unpredictable terrain. Even the concept of bandwidth prioritization, where an internet service provider might speed up video streaming while slowing down other traffic, finds its ancient counterpart in the Mongol Payza, a tablet that granted its bearer absolute priority on the roads of the empire. This historical thread reveals a crucial and often unsettling truth. The struggle over information is a constant in human history, not a unique product of our digital age. The tools have evolved from wax seals to end-to-end encryption, from horse relays to fiber optic cables, from whispered rumors to algorithmically amplified disinformation campaigns. But the fundamental dynamics remain eerily familiar. The state, or the corporate entity that functions like a state, still seeks to monitor communication, shape public opinion, and suppress narratives that threaten its authority. And in response, people continue to find ingenious ways to subvert these controls, using virtual private networks and encrypted apps just as their ancestors used smuggled letters and secret symbols. Recognizing this long arc of history is empowering. It allows us to see that our current challenges with data privacy, fake news, and digital surveillance are not unprecedented crises, but merely the latest chapter in an ancient story. The players and the props have changed, but the plot, the eternal battle to control the story everyone believes, is one we have been acting out for thousands of years. While the empires of the Old World refined their systems over centuries, the Spanish Empire faced a challenge of an entirely different magnitude, governing a vast, uncharted continent an ocean away. The sheer distance between Madrid and the silver mines of Potosi created an information vacuum, a gap of months between an action and its consequences. Into this void, the Spanish crown inserted a meticulously controlled pipeline for truth, the Corio or Grand Postal Service. Established in the early 16th century, this wasn't just a mail system. It was the central nervous system for the entire colonial project, and its primary function was to ensure that the version of reality received in the royal court was one that justified continued expansion and exploitation, no matter the human cost on the ground. The logistical feat of the Corio was in itself staggering. It had to contend with a geography that made European roads look like garden paths. Official messengers, known as couriers, traveled routes that spanned from the port of Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico, over the towering Sierra Madre Oriental Mountains, down to the capital in Mexico City. Another route stretched from the Isthmus of Panama, where goods and messages from Peru were unloaded, across the jungle and up to the Caribbean ports for the long Atlantic crossing. These were not rides through the countryside. They were perilous expeditions threatened by tropical diseases, hostile indigenous groups, bandits, and treacherous terrain. The Crown established a system of posters, relay stations similar to those in Europe, but often just simple huts where a rider could find a fresh mule, the beast of choice for mountain paths, and a few hours of shelter. The entire enterprise was a testament to Spanish determination, but its purpose was far more calculated than mere communication. That purpose was control. The Spanish crown understood that knowledge was power, and in the New World they held a monopoly on its long-distance transmission. The Consejo de Indias, the powerful governing body for the colonies, mandated that all official correspondence, reports from viceroys, judicial inquiries, financial statements, and military dispatches must travel via the official Corio. Private letters could sometimes hitch a ride, but they were subject to inspection and delay. This gave the crown an incredible advantage. It became the sole author of the narrative. A viceroy in Mexico City might write a lengthy, detailed report on a violent uprising, describing its root causes in Spanish land encroachment and brutal labor practices. But by the time that report had been copied, summarized, and filtered through layers of bureaucrats in Seville who were keen to please their king, the story could be transformed into a simple tale of unruly natives subdued by brave Spanish captains, thus justifying requests for more soldiers and harsher punishments. The original, complicated truth was lost in transit, replaced by a sanitized, useful fiction. This manipulation allowed some of history's most devastating atrocities to continue unchecked for generations. The most glaring example was the system of forced indigenous labor, particularly in the silver mines at Potosi and the mercury mines at Huancavelica. Priests like Bartolomé de los Casas sent horrifyingly detailed letters to the crown describing the unimaginable suffering. Men, women, and children worked to death in toxic, collapsing tunnels. These appeals for justice and humanity were entered into the official record, but they were often counterbalanced or outright buried by dispatches from colonial authorities and mine owners. These officials would send their own reports via the same official channels, downplaying the death tolls, emphasizing the immense wealth being generated for the crown, and framing the labor as a necessary part of the natives' civilizing process and Christian education. The Corio didn't just carry the lie, it gave it the official stamp of authenticity, allowing the king in Madrid to believe, or at least claim to believe, that his rule was both benevolent and profitable. The system provided the perfect alibi for moral negligence on a continental scale. Economically, this control of information was a tool for grand deception and mismanagement. The colonies were often run as a kleptocracy, with local officials embezzling vast sums of royal revenue. Yet their official financial reports, sent on the king's own postal ships, would show everything in perfect order. A governor could siphon off a fortune from the silver fleets, and the official correspondence arriving in Spain would praise his efficient administration and record profits. By the time an independent auditor might be dispatched a journey that could take a year-round trip, the books could be cooked, witnesses paid off, and the auditor himself might be bribed with a share of the spoils. His own report back to Spain, traveling again on the official Corio Mayor, would then confirm the original lie. The postal monopoly created a perfect, closed loop of corruption where the truth was systematically filtered out, and the crown was left making critical economic decisions based on a fantasil and of numbers and reports. The most enduring and damaging narrative perpetuated by this system was the myth of the Spanish civilizing mission. The constant stream of correspondence that flowed back to Europe was filled with tales of grand cathedrals built, of millions of souls baptized, of new cities rising from the wilderness. This curated story presented the conquest as a glorious, divine endeavor, a necessary and ultimately beneficial bringing of light to darkness. The reports that spoke of cultural genocide, of shattered communities, and of introduced diseases decimating entire populations were classified, delayed, or simply ignored. The Corio Mayor ensured that the triumphant, sanitized version was the one that shaped European public opinion and historical record for centuries. It allowed the Spanish Empire to not only commit atrocities but to write the history of those atrocities in a way that glorified the perpetrators and erased the voices of the victims, demonstrating with brutal clarity that the control of communication is ultimately the power to control memory itself. While the Spanish Empire used its postal service to hide the brutal realities of conquest, a new and even more potent kind of power was rising in the East, one that wore the mask of commerce but wielded the sword of an empire. The British East India Company arrived in India not with a royal army, but with a charter and a singular, relentless focus on profit. To protect and expand its unimaginable wealth, the company realized it needed to do more than just trade. It needed to govern, to spy, and to control the very narrative of the subcontinent. And so it built its own private postal network, a system that would become the central nervous system for the greatest corporate takeover in history, proving that the control of information is not just a tool for kings and emperors, but for any entity with the ambition to rule. The company's postal service began humbly in the late 1600s, little more than a few runners carrying commercial invoices and shipping manifests between its fortified trading posts, known as factories, along the coast. But as the company's ambitions grew, so did its need for intelligence. This was not a nation-state building a system for public administration. This was a corporation building a proprietary network for competitive advantage. They established a formal postal service, which they tellingly named the company Bahadur's Dak, with Dak being the Persian-derived word for mail and Bahadur meaning brave or authority, a title that revealed their self-image as a sovereign power. This network quickly grew to eclipse even the existing Mongol imperial systems in its efficiency and reach, creating a web of communication that connected the boardrooms in London to the most remote indigo plantations in Bengal. The primary fuel for this system was not governance but greed. The company's entire business model relied on arbitrage, buying low in one market and selling high in another. To do this effectively, they needed to control market information with an iron grip. Their postal network became a real-time financial wire service. A company agent in the cotton fields of Gujarat could learn of a poor harvest weeks before local Indian merchants, thanks to a fast-moving chain of riders. He could then use this intelligence to buy up existing stocks at a low price before the shortage became widely known, or to manipulate futures contracts to the company's immense benefit. This information asymmetry wasn't just a clever business tactic. It was a form of economic warfare that systematically drained wealth from local economies and funneled it into the company's coffers. The mail runner carrying a sealed market report was in effect a soldier on the front line of corporate conquest. But as the company transitioned from a trading enterprise to a territorial ruler following its victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the function of its postal network evolved with terrifying speed. It was no longer just about controlling prices, it was about controlling people. The DAC became the essential tool for surveilling and suppressing native resistance. A vast apparatus of Indian informants known as Hakaras was employed. These men were the eyes and ears of the company, blending seamlessly into the local population. They would report on the mood in the bazaars, the movements of disgruntled local rulers, and the whispers of planned uprisings. Their dispatches would race along the company's routes, allowing a small contingent of British officers to anticipate dissent and crush it with overwhelming preemptive force. The network allowed the company to project a sense of omniscience, making its rule seem inevitable and its intelligence network unbeatable. This control extended into a deliberate campaign of cultural and ideological shaping. The company's mail bags carried more than just spy reports and invoices. They carried the tools of soft power, textbooks designed to teach a British-centric version of history, administrative manuals that imposed English common law over local legal traditions, and correspondence promoting Western education were all distributed through this official channel. The goal was to create a class of Indian clerks, administrators, and intermediaries who were culturally aligned with British ideals and loyal to the company that employed them. They were quite literally mailing their own culture into the fabric of Indian society, using the postal system to create a new reality where British values were synonymous with modernity and progress, while indigenous knowledge and traditions were systematically marginalized and erased. The ultimate testament to the company's power was its ability to write the story of its own actions for both Indian and British audiences. Official dispatches sent back to London were masterclasses in narrative manipulation. A violent pacification campaign against a rebellious village would be reframed in the mail reports as a necessary police action to restore order and protect trade. The catastrophic famines that swept through Bengal in the late 18th century, exacerbated by the company's ruthless tax collection and resource extraction, were described as unavoidable natural disasters, with the company's own role in the tragedy carefully edited out. This controlled flow of information ensured that shareholders in London continued to see the company as a heroic and profitable venture, while Parliament remained largely ignorant of the human cost of its dividends. The mail ship leaving Calcutta carried a sanitized truth, a corporate annual report written in blood but phrased in the dry, respectable language of commerce and civilization. The British East India Company's postal network stands as a chilling precedent, a stark reminder that when corporate power merges with imperial ambition, the first casualty is always the truth, and the weapon of choice is always the control of information. At the heart of every imperial postal system lay a profound and unsettling insight into human nature itself. Rulers from Darius to Genghis Khan intuitively grasped something that modern psychology would later confirm. Our understanding of reality is not built on a foundation of pure, objective facts, but is instead a fragile construct woven together from the stories we hear most often and from the sources we are conditioned to trust. This is why simply having a fast horse wasn't enough. You had to be the first and most authoritative voice in the room. By seizing control of the primary channels of information, these empires weren't just delivering news, they were building the very stage upon which the drama of daily life was performed, and they held the only script. This manipulation works because our brains are wired for cognitive efficiency. We simply don't have the time or mental energy to personally verify every single piece of information we encounter. Instead, we rely on mental shortcuts known as heuristics. One of the most powerful is the availability heuristic, the idea that the things we can most easily recall, the stories that are most frequently repeated and readily available in our minds, must be the most true or the most important. The Imperial postal system weaponized this mental shortcut. By flooding the information space with a constant, repetitive stream of proclamations, victory bulletins, and religious edicts, they made their version of events the most available narrative. A citizen in a distant Roman province might hear a vague rumor of a military setback, but that whisper would be drowned out by the 10 official messages proclaiming glorious victories that arrived via the Cursus Publicus and were read aloud by imposing heralds in the forum. The official story wasn't just louder. By virtue of its sheer omnipresence, it felt more real. This constant repetition taps into another deep-seated psychological principle, the illusory truth effect. Studies have shown that people are more likely to believe a statement to be true if they have heard it before, even if they know it's false. The mere act of repetition creates a faint glimmer of familiarity, which our brains often misinterpret as accuracy. The empires of old were masters of this long before the term was coined. The phrase, "the emperor is divine" or "the Khan is invincible" wasn't just stated once. It was etched into monuments, woven into poetry, and stamped onto every official dispatch that raced across the continents. This wasn't just boasting, it was a deliberate psychological campaign to make an idea feel so familiar that questioning it would feel unnatural, like doubting that the sun would rise. Furthermore, these controlled information ecosystems expertly exploited our innate desire for social conformity and our fear of isolation. This is known as social proof. When everyone around you seems to believe a particular narrative, the pressure to conform is immense. The postal system ensured that this perceived consensus was manufactured. In a small town, if the only news anyone ever received was the official imperial version, and if the local governor and priests all reinforced that message, dissenting would mean standing utterly alone against the entire perceived social order. The system created a powerful echo chamber where the only echoes were the ones the empire wanted to hear, making any alternative viewpoint seem not just wrong, but dangerously deviant and socially suicidal. The truth became, for most people, simply what everyone else seemed to believe was true. Ultimately, this psychological control was about more than just compliance. It was about constructing a shared identity. The stories delivered by these royal couriers did more than report events. They told people who they were and what they were a part of. They spoke of a glorious Roman civilization bringing order to barbaric lands, or a divine Persian king uniting diverse peoples under a single just rule, or a Mongol destiny to rule the world under the eternal blue sky. These narratives offered a sense of belonging to something larger than oneself, a powerful psychological need. By framing their rule as essential to this shared identity, empires made loyalty to the state synonymous with loyalty to one's own community and sense of self. To challenge the emperor's truth was to unravel the very fabric of that identity, a price most people were unwilling to pay. The genius of these early information systems was their understanding that the most effective cage for the human mind is not built with bars of iron, but with the comforting, familiar, and constantly reinforced walls of a shared story. This fascinating divergence in approach between Eastern and Western empires reveals a great deal about their underlying philosophies of power. In the East, particularly in ancient China and Persia, the ideal was a perfectly centralized, harmonious system where control emanated from a single, god-like figure at the center. The Chinese imperial post, which evolved over dynasties into a remarkably sophisticated network known as the Yizhan system, was the physical manifestation of this philosophy. It was designed as a closed loop, with all information flowing directly to and from the Son of Heaven in the capital. The mandate of heaven was not just a political idea, it was a cosmological principle that positioned the emperor as the sole link between the divine and the earthly realms. Therefore, controlling communication was about maintaining that cosmic order. Any information from a provincial governor or a frontier general had to pass through the hands of the imperial censors and bureaucrats in the capital before it could be considered official or true. This created a powerful filter, ensuring that the emperor's court defined reality for the entire empire, and local interpretations or competing narratives were systematically eliminated before they could even form. The system was less about gathering diverse intelligence and more about confirming the central authority's pre-existing worldview, creating a feedback loop that reinforced the emperor's omnipotence. Western empires, beginning with Rome and continuing through the later European monarchies, operated on a fundamentally different model out of sheer necessity. The Roman Republic's legacy of granting significant autonomy to regional magistrates and the vast, culturally diverse nature of their territories made pure, top-down control impossible. Instead, they perfected a system of delegated authority. The Roman governor of Gaul had his own intelligence networks and couriers to manage his province, and he was expected to use his own judgment. He would send reports back to Rome, but he wasn't merely a passive relay, he was an active interpreter of events on the ground. This meant the truth in the Roman Empire was often a negotiated reality, a constant dialogue between the center and the periphery. The central authority in Rome provided the overarching narrative, the glory of Rome, the divinity of the emperor, but it allowed local commanders and administrators the flexibility to implement that narrative in a way that made sense for their specific context. This created a more dynamic and sometimes more chaotic information environment where regional truths could flourish, as long as they ultimately served the broader interests of the empire. These structural differences directly influenced the technology and symbolism of their communication. In the East, the emphasis was on authentication and exclusivity. The Chinese used tallies, intricate seals, and standardized written characters that were incredibly difficult to forge, all designed to prove a message's origin from the center and its unquestionable authority. The message itself was often a command, a decree, or a piece of administrative data that required compliance, not discussion. In the West, the technology often focused on speed and reliability for a more diverse set of users. The Roman roads were open to merchants, private citizens, and soldiers, even though the Cursus Publicus itself was restricted. This created a more porous information environment where official and unofficial news could intermingle. The Roman seal was important, but so was the authority of the individual carrying the message, a trusted general or a respected senator. The message was as likely to be a request for advice or a report on local conditions as it was a direct order, reflecting that constant negotiation between the center and the edges of power. Ultimately, despite these contrasting methods, the destination was startlingly similar: the consolidation of imperial truth, whether through the Eastern model of imposing a single, celestial narrative from the top down, or the Western model of managing and co-opting multiple regional narratives through a process of delegation and integration, the outcome was the erosion of local, competing truths. The Persian king's word, carried on the royal road, became the final arbiter of justice and fact from Egypt to India. The Roman emperor's pronouncements, disseminated through the Cursus Publicus and reinforced by the armies of his provincial governors, defined reality from Britain to Syria. Both systems, in their own ways, understood that an empire is not just a territory on a map. It is a story that people believe in. And the most powerful empire is the one that owns the pen, the parchment, and the courier network that writes that story into existence every single day, convincing millions of people across continents that there is no other version of events worth hearing. Yet even the most powerful empires are not eternal. The magnificent postal systems that once bound continents together did not vanish in a single day, but rather faded and fractured alongside the decaying states they served. The great Roman roads, though still physically present, fell into disrepair as the imperial treasury could no longer afford their upkeep. The meticulously spaced way stations of the Cursus Publicus were abandoned, their roofs caving in and their stables empty, becoming lonely ruins on a landscape where centralized power was itself becoming a memory. The Mongol Yam, that terrifyingly efficient nervous system of the steppe empire, lost its fearsome coordination as the great Khanates squabbled and split, its once prized Pesa tablets now meaningless symbols to the new warlords who rose to power. The infrastructure remained, but the central intelligence, the will that gave it purpose and direction, had dissipated, leaving behind a skeleton of a system without a brain to guide it. This decline, however, did not mean the end of the desire to control information. It simply meant that the tools and the players changed. As the age of sprawling multi-ethnic empires gave way to the rise of smaller, more culturally unified nation-states, the model for postal control shifted. Kings of France and England no longer had to manage the vast distances of a Genghis Khan, but they were now obsessed with a new kind of control, building a shared national identity within their own borders. They established royal postal services not just for administration, but as tools to spread a standardized national language, to promote loyalty to the crown over the local feudal lord, and to circulate government-sponsored newspapers that told a unified national story. The goal was no longer to project power across continents, but to forge a single, homogeneous people from a patchwork of regional dialects and loyalties. The method of narrative control became more focused, more introspective, and in many ways more sophisticated. Perhaps the most significant revolution came with the breakdown of the state's absolute monopoly. The invention of the printing press was a catastrophic blow to top-down information control, but it was the rise of private postal services that truly democratized communication. In the 17th and 18th centuries, enterprising families across Europe began establishing their own competing mail companies. These services were faster, more reliable, and available to anyone who could pay the postage. For the first time, merchants, scientists, philosophers, and ordinary citizens could correspond with each other quickly and reliably, completely bypassing the slow, censored channels of the royal post. The flow of information burst its official banks, creating a vibrant, chaotic, and uncontrollable delta of ideas. This was the environment that made the Enlightenment possible. A continent-wide conversation conducted through private letters and pamphlets, where the ideas of Voltaire, Locke, and Rousseau could spread and cross-pollinate without needing a king's permission. The genie of public discourse was out of the bottle, and no amount of royal decrees could ever force it back in. The final, seeming blow to the old imperial model arrived with the telegraph and the dawn of digital communication. The telegraph wire made the speed of a galloping horse seem laughably archaic, annihilating distance and time in a way that Darius or Augustus could never have conceived. Then came the telephone, radio, television, and finally the internet, each new technology promising a more open, connected, and democratized world. It appeared that the age of centralized information control was well and truly over, a relic of a more authoritarian past. But this was a profound and dangerous misconception. The methods of control did not disappear. They simply evolved, becoming more subtle, more psychological, and more deeply embedded in the technology itself. The great lesson from the fall of these imperial systems is not that the desire to control narrative vanished, but that it became more decentralized and more competitive. The nation-state did not give up its tools, it merely refined them for a new era of mass media and public opinion. And meanwhile, new powers arose to compete for control of the story. Corporations, media conglomerates, and later, massive tech platforms began to wield influence that rivaled that of governments. They learned the old imperial lesson well. Whoever controls the most powerful communication channels holds immense sway over what people believe to be true. The struggle is no longer between a single emperor and his subjects, but between a dizzying array of actors, states, corporations, activists, and algorithms, all vying to shape reality in their favor. The arena has changed, but the ancient, enduring human thirst to hear an unfiltered truth, and the equally powerful desire of others to filter it for us, remains the central drama of our information age. It's a sobering thought that the strategies we've explored developed by emperors and khans centuries ago are not confined to the history books. They are alive and well, operating at a scale and speed those ancient rulers could never have imagined, right inside our pockets and on our screens. The digital age, for all its promises of openness and connection, has simply provided a new set of tools for the same old game. The battle to control what people believe is true. The social media feed has become the new royal road, and the algorithm has replaced the imperial courier as the primary arbiter of reality. Think about it. What is a social media algorithm, if not the digital, hyper-evolved descendant of the Byzantine censor or the Persian station master? Its primary function is to decide what information you see, in what order, and from which sources. Just as the Roman Cursus Publicus gave priority to official imperial bulletins, these algorithms are designed to prioritize content that maximizes engagement, content that makes us angry, fearful, or outrageously loyal. This isn't a neutral process. It's a curation that shapes our perception of the world. An empire's goal was to create a shared narrative of its own invincibility and benevolence. Today, our digital ecosystems often create personalized, fragmented narratives that confirm our existing biases, making us feel uniquely informed while locking us into isolated information bubbles. The outcome is strikingly similar. We are presented with a version of reality that serves the interests of the platform, which profits from our attention, and sometimes those of other powerful actors who have learned to manipulate the system. And just as empires employed spies and agents to spread specific narratives, we now have state-sponsored troll farms and coordinated inauthentic accounts. These are not random internet users. They are the modern equivalent of the Byzantine agents in reviews or the Mongol scouts, working systematically to poison the information well. They create thousands of fake profiles to artificially amplify certain messages, manufacture the illusion of grassroots support for a policy or politician, a tactic known as astroturfing, and flood conversations with disinformation to confuse and paralyze public debate. Their goal isn't to convince you of a specific fact, but to erode the very idea that objective truth can exist, creating a cynical, bewildered population that is easier to manipulate. This is the same psychological playbook used by ancient empires. If you can control the narrative, you don't need to win the argument. Perhaps the most direct parallel is in the use of modern propaganda, which has evolved from stone inscriptions and royal heralds into memes, deepfakes, and targeted advertising. The precision is new, but the intent is ancient. A viral piece of misinformation seeded into the right online community at the right time can race across the globe at the speed of light, far outpacing any effort to correct it. This mirrors the advantage the Persian Royal Road gave its rulers the power to be the first to define an event. In the critical hours after a news event, the first story to gain traction, regardless of its truth, often sets the narrative in stone for millions of people. This digital age propaganda can be micro-targeted, delivering a specific, manipulative message to a narrow demographic, say, discouraging a particular group from voting with an efficiency that would make any ancient emperor green with envy. Understanding this long history is our greatest defense. It allows us to step back and see these not as unprecedented, terrifying new phenomena, but as the latest iterations of an ancient struggle. When we recognize the techniques, the creation of information monopolies, the weaponization of speed, the use of authentication to grant authority to some voices and silence others, we can become more conscious consumers of information. We can start to ask ourselves, who benefits from this narrative? Why am I seeing this story now? What alternative perspectives are being suppressed or slowed down? This historical perspective doesn't make the challenge any less serious, but it does make it less disorienting. It empowers us to see through the digital pazer and question the authority of the modern couriers, realizing that the fight for truth has been with us for millennia, and the skills to win it are written in our own past. This brings us to a deeply uncomfortable and enduring question, one that has shadowed every story we've told so far. Is it ever morally right for a government to control the truth? The emperors and kings we've discussed would have argued passionately that it was not just their right but their solemn duty. From their perspective, they weren't lying to their people. They were maintaining cosmic order, preventing chaos, and ensuring the very survival of the state. They operated under a philosophy often called the doctrine of raison d'etat, or reason of state, which holds that the welfare of the nation is the supreme law, justifying actions that would be considered immoral if undertaken by an individual. In a vast pre-modern empire filled with diverse cultures and constant threats, a single, unifying narrative wasn't a luxury, it was the essential glue holding society together. The alternative, they believed, was fragmentation, rebellion, and a descent into a dark age where no truth could survive at all. We can see a clear, if troubling, argument for this perspective. Imagine you are a Roman emperor hearing the first whispers of a plague in a distant province. Do you release this information immediately, potentially triggering a mass panic that clogs the roads with fleeing citizens, ensures the disease spreads even faster, and crashes the economy? Or do you use your control of the Cursus Publicus to manage the news, quietly deploying doctors and supplies while publicly projecting an image of calm control to prevent a societal meltdown? This is the classic security versus liberty dilemma applied to information. The state argues that in moments of extreme crisis, a temporary suspension of the full, unvarnished truth is a necessary medicine to keep the patient, the body politic, alive. The goal is stability, and stability, they contend, is the prerequisite for all other rights, including the eventual return to truthful discourse. Yet for every supposed act of benevolent stability, there are 1,000 acts of outright oppression justified by the exact same logic. This is the slippery slope that makes information control so ethically perilous. The same system that might, in theory, be used to cautiously manage news of a plague is also the system the Spanish crown used to hide the horrors of the encomienda labor system for generations. It's the system the British East India Company used to disguise its economic rapaciousness as benevolent civilization. The line between necessary stability and self-serving oppression is vanishingly thin, and it is almost always drawn by the very people in power who stand to benefit from the deception. Once a government grants itself the authority to define reality for its citizens, that power becomes almost impossible to revoke and irresistibly tempting to abuse. The argument of stability can easily become a blanket excuse to silence any and all dissent, Chinese letter corruption, and to maintain the privileges of a ruling elite at the direct expense of the people they are supposed to serve. This forces us to confront a fundamental human right, the right to truth. This isn't just about a desire to be informed. It's about the autonomy to make decisions about our own lives based on accurate information. When an empire hides the extent of a famine to keep tax revenues flowing, it is robbing its people of the ability to prepare, to migrate, or to plead for aid. When a corporation like the East India Company manipulates market information, it is stealing the rightful profits from local merchants and farmers. This is a profound form of theft, the theft of agency itself. Citizens treated like children who cannot handle difficult truths are inevitably infantilized, unable to develop the critical faculties needed to participate meaningfully in their own governance. A society built on a foundation of managed narratives is a society that can never truly mature, forever dependent on the paternalistic and often deceitful guidance of its rulers. The legacy of these ancient systems challenges us to find a balance in our own time. We instinctively recoil from the idea of a ministry of truth, yet we accept that governments must sometimes operate with secrecy for genuine national security reasons. The ethical difference lies in accountability, transparency, and intent. Is the information being controlled to protect a specific operational secret with clear oversight and a sunset clause, or is it to shape public opinion permanently in favor of those in power? The modern debate over surveillance, encryption, and disinformation campaigns is simply the latest battlefield in this ancient war. Are we protecting citizens, or are we controlling them? Are we ensuring stability, or are we enforcing compliance? The answers are rarely simple, but the history of imperial postal systems serves as a massive, millennia-long warning sign. The power to control information is the most addictive and corrosive power a state can possess, and it must be guarded against with eternal vigilance, because those who get to define reality get to rule it. The history of these incredible networks reveals a timeless and powerful truth that echoes across the centuries. Those who control the channels of communication ultimately control the very reality people believe in. From the sun-baked stones of the Persian Royal Road to the windswept relay stations of the Mongol Yam, empires didn't just build these systems to move messages, they built them to move minds. They were the original architects of reality, using their control over information to craft glorious narratives of invincibility, to silence whispers of dissent before they could become shouts, and to project their power across unimaginable distances, making a single version of the truth feel inevitable and universal. This was the ultimate source of their strength, the invisible glue that held diverse and sprawling territories together under one banner, proving that the most effective conquest isn't always of land but of perception. While the technology has transformed beyond recognition from galloping horses to gigabit fiber optics, the fundamental struggle at the heart of it all remains eerily unchanged. We are still living in the same ancient story, just with a different set of props. the social media algorithms that curate our news feeds, the state-sponsored disinformation campaigns that flood our digital town squares, the hidden biases in search results. These are our era's version of the Imperial Courier, the Royal Censor, and the Sealed Scroll. The battlefield has shifted from physical roads to digital networks, but the war is still over the same precious territory: our attention, our beliefs, and our understanding of what is real and what is not. This long history, then, is far more than a fascinating tale from the past. It is our most powerful tool for navigating the present. By understanding how these systems of control were built and operated centuries ago, we gain a kind of X-ray vision to see through the modern manipulations that surround us. It empowers us to become more conscious, more critical consumers of information. We can start to ask the essential questions: who benefits from this narrative? Why am I seeing this story now? What alternative perspectives are being suppressed or slowed down? This knowledge doesn't make us cynical, but rather vigilant. It encourages us to seek out transparency, to value diverse sources, and to resist the seductive simplicity of a single, centralized truth. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through the hidden arteries of ancient power. We've traveled from Persia to Rome, from the steppes of Mongolia to the halls of Byzantine intrigue, uncovering the surprising ways the males shaped our world. If this exploration of history's first information wars has given you a new perspective, please let us know by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the past. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What parallels do you see between these ancient systems and our digital world today? Your engagement helps us continue telling these important stories. Until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and remember, the truth is always worth the ride.